I was sitting in a cramped real estate office pen, hovering inches above the paper that would end my life as I knew it when the door opened, and 3 strangers walked in with a lawyer. The room went quiet, in a way I'd never felt before, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The lawyer said my name slowly, carefully, as if testing whether I was real. When he mentioned a blizzard from years ago, my hand began to shake so badly I had to set the pen down. I had no idea that the worst day of my life was about to collide with one small forgotten act of kindness I barely remembered. 11 years earlier, I wasn't sitting in an office signing away my home. I was standing in my kitchen, staring out the front window as snow fell sideways, thick and relentless, burying the street faster than the plows could keep up. It was February of 2014, one of those winters folks around here still talk about, the kind that shuts down highways and turns the whole town into a white, silent world. The power had flickered twice already, and the wind howled like something alive, rattling the windows and shaking the porch light. I was still working back then, long before my daughter's medical bills took over every corner of my life. I'd come home early that afternoon after my supervisor told us to get off the roads while we still could. I remember hanging up my coat, making a pot of soup, and thinking I'd ride the storm out alone, same as I always did. My daughter was spending the weekend with a friend, and the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every creak and groan. Just after dark, there was a knock at the door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Who would be out in weather like that? The wind was fierce enough to knock a grown man off his feet. Then the knock came again, louder this time, uneven and desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, snow-caked into his coat and beard, his face red from the cold. Behind him was a woman clutching a little boy no more than 6 or 7, his cheeks pale and eyes glassy. Their car had died a mile down the road, the man explained, his voice shaking. No cell service? No nearby houses with lights on. They'd been walking until they saw mine. I remember hesitating. Not because I didn't want to help, but because every instinct drilled into me over a lifetime said to be careful. I was a woman living alone. It was late. The weather made people unpredictable. For just a second, I thought about giving them blankets and pointing them toward the fire station 2 miles away. Then I looked at the boy. He was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering, and the woman's hands were trembling as she held him. That was the moment my hesitation ended. I opened the door wide and told them to come inside. I settled them in the living room, laid out blankets, and poured hot soup into bowls while they thawed by the heater. The man kept apologizing, saying they didn't want to be a burden, that they'd leave as soon as the storm let up. I told him to stop talking like that. Anyone with sense would do the same, I said, and I meant it. We didn't talk much after that. The boy fell asleep, curled up on the couch, the woman brushing his hair back gently, her eyes full of worry and exhaustion. The man offered me cash, pressing folded bills into my hand, but I pushed it back toward him. Just get through the night, I said. That's all that matters. They stayed until morning. By then the wind had died down, and the world outside looked brand new, covered in clean, untouched snow. I helped them scrape ice off their car, waved as they drove away, and went back inside to my quiet house. That should have been the end of it. And for a long time, it was. Years passed. Life did what life always does. I worked, I paid bills. I watched my daughter grow into a bright, stubborn young woman who laughed too loud and loved too fiercely. Then came the doctor's appointments, the tests, the words no parent ever wants to hear. Heart surgery. At first I told myself we'd manage, we always had, but the bills piled up faster than I could keep track of them. Insurance covered some things, but not nearly enough. I took on extra shifts, I drained my savings, I sold anything that wasn't nailed down. Still, it wasn't enough. That's when the house came into the conversation. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was where my daughter learned to ride her bike, where we celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I'd opened the door on a blizzard night to people who needed help. But none of that mattered when the surgeon looked me in the eye and explained what would happen if we delayed the operation. So I made the call. By the time I was sitting in that real estate office 11 years after the storm, I felt hollowed out. The buyer was ready. The papers were stacked neatly on the table. All I had to do was sign. I kept telling myself it was just a building. that my daughter's life mattered more. Then the door opened, and everything I thought I understood about kindness, sacrifice, and the long reach of our choices began to unravel. After that day in the real estate office, my mind kept drifting backward, as if it needed to trace every step that had led me there. It wasn't one big mistake or one bad choice. It was years of ordinary living, the kind no one writes stories about, quietly stacking on top of each other until the weight became too much to carry. In the years after, the Blizzard life settled into a steady rhythm. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, paid bills, and did my best to give my daughter a normal childhood. We lived in a small town where people waved from their cars and noticed if your porch light was out. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. I had what most folks around here would call a decent life. I never talked much about my time in the Marine Corps. Around here, people either made too big a deal out of military service or pretended it didn't exist. I preferred neither. The Corps had shaped me in quiet ways. Discipline, thrift, the habit of getting through hard things without complaining. I didn't wear it on my sleeve, but it showed in how I lived. I planned ahead. I saved when I could. I didn't ask for help easily. My daughter Emily was the center of my world. She was the kind of kid who asked big questions and never accepted half answers. She loved animals, hated bullies, and had a laugh that filled up the room. When she was younger, she used to sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked, swinging her legs and telling me about her day. Those were the moments that made everything else feel manageable. The first signs that something was wrong came quietly. Emily started getting tired more easily. She'd come home from school and go straight to her room, something she'd never done before. At first, I chalked it up to growing pains or too much homework. Kids change after all. But then came the shortness of breath, the dizziness, the way she'd press her hand to her chest and frown like she was trying to solve a puzzle inside her own body. Doctor's appointments became a regular part of our schedule. Tests led to more tests. Words like monitoring and precautionary were used a lot at first, soft words meant to keep parents calm. I nodded, asked the right questions, and told myself we'd be fine. I'd faced worse things than uncertainty. I could handle this too. But uncertainty has a way of turning into something solid when you least expect it. The day the cardiologist sat us down and spoke plainly, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Heart surgery wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a necessity. He explained the risks, the timelines, the urgency. I listened carefully, the same way I had listened to briefings years ago, committing every detail to memory. Emily sat beside me, quiet and brave, her hand tucked into mine. On the drive home, she finally broke the silence. "Am I going to be okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "We're going to take care of this." I believed it when I said it, or maybe I needed to. The bills started arriving not long after. Even with insurance, the numbers were staggering. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. I made spreadsheets, cut corners, canceled anything that wasn't essential. I took extra hours at work, then more. I came home exhausted and still lay awake at night running numbers in my head. Friends offered sympathy casseroles rides. I thanked them and smiled and said we were managing. Pride is a hard thing to let go of, especially when you've built your whole identity around being capable. I didn't want to be the person everyone whispered about, the one who couldn't keep it together. As the months went on, the situation tightened like a knot. Savings accounts dwindled. Credit cards filled up. I sold my old car and bought something cheaper. I put off repairs around the house, telling myself they could wait. Through it all, I kept one line I wouldn't cross. The house. That house was my anchor. It was stability, history, proof that I'd built something lasting. Selling it felt like admitting failure, like letting go of the one thing that said I'd done right by my daughter. But medicine doesn't care about pride, and hospitals don't accept good intentions as payment. The doctor was clear about the timeline. Waiting wasn't an option. Every delay increased the risk. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one night, the same table where Emily used to do her homework, staring at the numbers until they blurred. I thought about the Blizzard night again, about how easily I'd opened my door because it was the right thing to do. There had been no calculations then, no spreadsheets, just a decision. This decision felt heavier, but the answer was the same. I called a real estate agent the next morning. She was kind, professional, and efficient, the kind of person who had delivered hard news many times before. She walked through the house with me, pointing out small things I could fix to improve the sale. I nodded, taking mental notes, already knowing it wouldn't matter much. Houses in our town sold quickly enough, especially ones like mine. When the for sale sign went up, it felt like a public announcement of my private failure. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed. Some stopped to ask questions. I gave vague answers. Others said nothing, just nodded with looks that mixed curiosity and pity. Emily tried to be strong about it. "We can live anywhere," she said once, squeezing my hand, "as long as we're together." That was the moment I nearly lost it. Instead, I hugged her and told her she was right. By the time the offer came in, I was beyond exhaustion. Accepting it felt like stepping off a cliff and trusting there would be ground on the other side. The closing date was set. Papers were prepared. Everything moved forward with an efficiency that felt almost cruel. And that was how I found myself sitting in that office 11 years after a blizzard I thought I'd left behind, preparing to sign away my home so my daughter could live. I didn't know then that the storm from my past was about to return in a way I never could have imagined. The night before the closing, I slept on the couch. I told myself it was because the bed felt too big, but the truth was I didn't want to lie in the same place where I'd spent years listening to my daughter breathe in the dark, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of her chest when she was sick. The living room felt safer somehow, like neutral ground. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click softly with each rotation, thinking about all the ways a life can narrow down to one impossible choice. Selling the house wasn't just a financial decision. It felt like erasing proof that I'd once been stable, capable, in control. This was the house where I'd unpacked boxes after my discharge from the Marines, telling myself I was finally done moving, done starting over. It was the house where Emily had taken her first steps, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the coffee table, while I hovered nearby, terrified and proud all at once. Every wall held a memory, and tomorrow I'd be handing it all over to strangers. In the morning, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, her legs tucked under her. She looked smaller than usual, wrapped in one of my old sweaters, her hair pulled back neatly. She'd learned to do that during all the hospital visits, look composed, ready, cooperative. It broke my heart every time. "You don't have to come with me," I told her gently. "I can do the signing myself." She shook her head. "I want to be there." I didn't argue. Some things aren't about protection, they're about honesty. The drive to the real estate office felt longer than it should have. Every stoplight was an opportunity to turn around, to postpone, to pretend there was another way. But the surgeon's words echoed in my head, steady and unyielding. Time mattered. Delay mattered. I kept driving. The office was clean and impersonal, beige walls decorated with framed photos of houses that all looked slightly happier than mine felt at that moment. The agent greeted us with a professional smile that softened when she saw Emily. She offered coffee, water, tissues, small kindnesses that almost made it worse. We sat at the table where the papers were already laid out in precise stacks. The contract, the disclosures, the pages that required initials, the pages that demanded full signatures. I ran my fingers along the edge of the first document, grounding myself the way I used to before difficult briefings. Read everything. Don't rush. Stay steady. As I signed, memories rose up uninvited. Fixing the leaky sink myself because calling a plumber felt like admitting defeat. Painting Emily's bedroom yellow after she'd begged for it, even though I hated the color. Sitting on the porch during summer evenings, listening to cicadas while the sun dipped low behind the trees. Ordinary moments, the kind you don't realize are precious until you're about to lose them. The agent explained the next steps, her voice calm and practiced. Funds would be released. The surgery could be scheduled. We'd have a short window to move out. Temporary housing options were mentioned, words like rental and storage unit floating through the room like distant echoes. I nodded at the appropriate times, absorbing information mechanically, my chest tight. Emily reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. I squeezed back, grateful for her strength, angry that she needed it at all. This is the right thing, I told myself silently and repeatedly. This is what a mother does. When it came time to sign the final page, the one that made everything official, I paused. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My name was printed there in black ink, waiting for me to confirm it, to finalize the decision. That was when the door opened. At first I didn't look up. I assumed it was another client or an agent stepping in with paperwork. But the room changed. The air shifted the way it does when something unexpected enters a space. The agent froze mid-sentence. Emily's grip on my hand tightened. I lifted my head. 3 people stood just inside the doorway, a man, a woman, and a young adult who hovered slightly behind them. With them was a lawyer briefcase in hand, his expression serious but not unkind. They didn't look angry. They didn't look confused. They looked focused, purposeful. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the agent. "Is this where we can find—" He glanced at a document, then looked directly at me. "Are you Ms. Carter?" Hearing my name from a stranger's mouth sent a chill through me. "Yes," I said cautiously. "We were hoping to speak with you," he continued. "It will only take a moment." The agent looked between us uncertain. "We're in the middle of a closing," she said carefully. "I'm aware," the lawyer replied. "That's why we're here." My heart began to pound. Years of military training kicked in, scanning for threats, for angles, for explanations. None presented themselves. These people didn't feel like danger. They felt like an interruption, one I didn't understand. The man stepped forward slightly. He looked older than I remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his posture a little stiff. The woman beside him clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with something I couldn't place. The young adult watched me intently, his gaze steady. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know if you remember us." Before I could answer, the lawyer spoke again. "In February of 2014, during a severe blizzard, my clients were stranded in this town. Their vehicle failed. They sought shelter." The room seemed to tilt. My mind raced backward through snow and wind and a little boy shivering on my couch. I stared at the faces in front of me, searching for recognition, for confirmation. The woman nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "You let us stay in your home," she said softly. "You saved us that night." The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the table. For a moment no one spoke. The sound of the pen hitting the table seemed to echo far louder than it should have. I stared at the 3 of them, my mind scrambling to line up memory with reality. The man's beard was trimmed now, neatly kept, but I recognized the eyes, the same guarded intensity I'd seen through the snow that night. The woman looked healthier, steadier, though her hands still twisted together the way they had when she stood in my doorway. The boy wasn't a boy anymore. He was a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing straight as if he'd learned early how to take up space in the world. I remember," I said finally, though my voice came out thinner than I expected. It was a bad storm. The agent shifted in her chair, clearly unsure whether she should interrupt or excuse herself. The lawyer raised a polite hand. "We won't take much of your time," he said, then looked directly at me. "But what we have to say matters. A great deal." My instincts told me to brace myself. In the Marines, moments like this, when a room goes quiet and everyone's attention narrows, usually meant something important was coming. I straightened in my chair, suddenly aware of Emily beside me, her eyes wide, her face pale. The man took a step forward. "My name is Daniel," he said. "This is my wife Laura, and this is our son Michael." Michael nodded at me, his expression solemn. There was something familiar about his eyes, something that tugged at my chest before I could place it. "We've been looking for you for a long time," Laura said. Her voice trembled despite her obvious effort to stay composed. "We didn't know your name back then. We didn't even think to ask. All we knew was this house. And your kindness." I swallowed hard. "You didn't have to look for me," I said. "Anyone would have done the same." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "they wouldn't have. And we know that now." The lawyer cleared his throat again and opened his briefcase, removing a folder thick with documents. The sight of paperwork made my stomach tighten. I was already drowning in forms and signatures. I didn't have room for more. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I represent the Matthews family. Over the past decade, they've made several attempts to locate you. Records inquiries, even driving through towns during winter storms hoping for a clue. It wasn't until recently, when this property was listed for sale, that we were finally able to confirm your identity." I blinked. "You found me because I'm selling my house?" "Yes," he said gently. And because you're selling it under circumstances that concern my clients. Emily leaned forward. What does that mean? She asked, her voice soft but steady. The lawyer glanced at me as if asking permission, then nodded. We're aware the sale is being made to cover medical expenses, he said, specifically a heart surgery. I felt a sharp jolt of alarm. How do you know that? Laura spoke before the lawyer could answer. We asked, she said simply. We didn't want to come here without understanding what you were facing. There was no accusation in her tone, no pity, just honesty. Daniel took another step forward, his eyes fixed on me. That night in 2014, he said we were out of options. The storm was getting worse. Michael was already hypothermic. We didn't know if he'd make it through the night. My chest tightened painfully. You didn't just give us shelter, he continued. You gave us time. Time to warm up, time to breathe, time to survive. Michael cleared his throat. I don't remember everything he said, his voice deeper than I expected. But I remember waking up on your couch. I remember the smell of soup. I remember feeling safe. Emily's hand slipped into mine, her grip firm. Daniel took a shaky breath. That night changed everything for us, he said. It forced us to confront how fragile life really is. After we left your house, I made decisions I'd been putting off for years. I took a risk. I rebuilt my business from the ground up. It wasn't easy, but it worked. The lawyer opened the folder and slid a document across the table toward me. Mr. Matthews's company experienced significant growth over the last decade, he said calmly. They're now in a position to address a debt they feel morally obligated to repay. I frowned. I didn't lend you money. No, Daniel said. You gave us something far more valuable. The room felt too small, too full of breath and expectation. The agent sat frozen, her pen hovering uselessly over her notepad. Laura reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges. I wrote this the morning after we left, she said. I never knew where to send it. She handed it to me. It was a thank you note. Simple, handwritten. The kind of thing people used to write more often. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The lawyer spoke quietly. Ms. Carter, the Matthews family has arranged to settle the outstanding debt associated with your daughter's surgery. In full. I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. What? They've also purchased this property, he continued, with the sole intention of transferring ownership back to you. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. That's not I started then stopped. You can't do that. Daniel met my gaze. We already did. Emily gasped softly beside me. And before you ask, the lawyer added, all legal and financial obligations will be handled through proper channels. No conditions, no publicity. This is not charity. It's restitution. I felt something crack inside me, something I'd been holding together with sheer will for years. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't do anything special, I whispered. Laura smiled through her own tears. You opened your door. The agent finally found her voice. I'll need to step out for a moment, she said, standing abruptly. As she left the room, silence rushed back in thicker than before. I looked at the papers on the table, the sale contract, the pen, the life I thought I was giving up, and then at the people who had walked in carrying a past I never expected to see again. Outside, snow began to fall, lightly drifting past the window like a quiet reminder. The storm, it seemed, wasn't finished with me yet. For a long time after the lawyer finished speaking, I couldn't move. I kept waiting for someone to tell me there had been a mistake, that wires had crossed, that this kind of thing didn't happen in real life. I'd lived long enough to know that good news usually came with strings attached, and miracles were something other people talked about, not something that knocked on your door during a house closing. Daniel must have sensed my disbelief. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, resting his hands flat on the table like he was grounding himself. Please, he said quietly. Let us explain. All of it. The lawyer nodded and closed the folder, giving us space. Emily leaned closer to me, her eyes darting between their faces, searching for reassurance. I squeezed her hand, though I was the one who felt like I might drift away if I let go. Daniel took a slow breath. After that night in the blizzard, we didn't just go home and forget about you, he said. I couldn't. I kept thinking about how easily things could have ended differently. One more mile. One more closed door. One person who decided it wasn't their problem. Laura picked up the thread, her voice steadier now. Michael got sick a few years later, she said. Not his heart, his lungs. He needed treatment we couldn't afford at the time. Sitting in that hospital room watching him sleep, I thought about you. About how you didn't owe us anything and still took us in. Michael looked down embarrassed, then back up at me. My parents used to tell me that story, he said. Every winter. They told me that if I ever had the chance to do something right for someone else, I didn't get to look the other way. I swallowed hard. I never meant it to be a lesson, I said. It was just what anyone should do. That's what makes it matter, Daniel replied gently. You didn't expect anything back. He explained how after that storm he'd taken a chance he'd been afraid of for years, expanding his business, hiring more people, pushing himself harder than ever before. It hadn't been smooth or easy. There were failures along the way, nights he lay awake wondering if he'd ruined everything. But he kept going, anchored by the memory of a stranger who had stepped into uncertainty without hesitation. The lawyer slid a new set of papers across the table, separate from the sale documents. These outline the financial arrangements, he said calmly. Your daughter's medical expenses have already been covered through a direct payment to the hospital. There's nothing you need to sign for that portion. My breath caught. Already, I asked. Yes, he said. We didn't want timing to be an issue. Emily let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed her face briefly into my shoulder. As for the house, the lawyer continued, the Matthews family completed the purchase this morning through a holding entity. The transfer back to you will be recorded immediately after this meeting. I shook my head slowly, overwhelmed. Why go through all this trouble, I asked. Why not just help with the surgery? Daniel leaned forward, his eyes intent. Because that house matters, he said. It mattered to you. It mattered to us. It was the place where someone chose to see us as human beings when we felt invisible. Laura nodded. And because we didn't want your kindness to cost you everything. Something inside me finally gave way. I covered my face with my hands and cried the kind of crying that comes from deep exhaustion rather than fresh pain. I hadn't cried like that since the night I agreed to sell the house when Emily had fallen asleep, and I'd let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to lose. When I looked up again, the lawyer was quietly pushing a box of tissues toward me. The agent was still outside giving us privacy. The room felt different now, lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. I don't know how to thank you, I said, my voice rough. You already did, Laura replied softly. We sat there for a while talking about small things, where they lived now, what Michael was studying in college, how Emily was feeling, what the doctors had said about her recovery. It felt strangely normal, like neighbors catching up after years apart, rather than strangers bound together by a moment neither side had ever forgotten. Eventually the agent returned, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the curiosity burning behind it. The lawyer explained that the sale was no longer proceeding, and that new documents would be filed immediately. She nodded, clearly stunned, but professional enough not to ask questions. When everything was settled, we stood. Daniel held out his hand, then thought better of it and pulled me into a brief, awkward hug. Laura did the same. Michael smiled at Emily and she smiled back, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in weeks. As they left, Daniel turned back once more. We don't want this to be the end, he said. We'd like to stay in touch, not because we owe you, because you're part of our story. I watched them walk out into the softly falling snow, my heart still racing. When the door closed behind them, the agent let out a long breath. Well, she said, shaking her head, I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen anything like that. Neither had I. But as I gathered my things and took Emily's hand, one thought settled firmly in my mind. The truth had finally come full circle. The kindness I'd given away without a second thought had found its way home. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. That alone still felt unreal to me. For months, every conversation with doctors had ended with tentative timelines and worried looks. Now suddenly there was a date on the calendar, circled in red ink, clear and final. Emily pretended not to notice how many times I checked it, but she knew. We both did. That date was the line between everything we feared and everything we hoped for. The morning of the surgery, the hospital smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Emily changed into her gown with quiet efficiency, cracking a small joke about the fashion choice that made the nurse laugh. I admired her strength even as it terrified me. No child should have to be that brave. When they wheeled her away, I sat in the waiting room and folded my hands together the way I used to before deployments, elbows on my knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. I didn't pray the way some people do with words and requests. I just sat there breathing, letting memories wash over me. Snow falling sideways, a knock at the door, a boy asleep on my couch. Hours passed in fragments, bad coffee, murmured conversations, the low hum of a television no one was really watching. When the surgeon finally came out, his mask pulled down, eyes tired but smiling, my knees nearly gave out. "She did very well," he said. I don't remember much after that. Just relief so sharp it almost hurt, and Emily's hand squeezing mine later when I was finally allowed into recovery. She looked pale, exhausted, but alive. Very much alive. In the weeks that followed, the house filled with a different kind of energy. Recovery is slow, especially when it involves the heart, but every small improvement felt like a victory. Emily walked a little farther each day. She laughed more, she slept better, and every morning when I woke up in my own bed under my own roof, gratitude settled over me like a warm blanket. Word traveled fast in a small town. At first it was quiet neighbors dropping off meals, asking gentle questions. Then it grew. People started stopping me at the grocery store, at the post office, outside the school. They'd heard pieces of the story. Some of them had filled in the gaps themselves. A few admitted they'd driven past my house when the for sale sign went up and wondered what had happened. "I had no idea," one woman said, shaking her head. "All those years and then this." "Neither did I wanted to say. None of us ever do." The Matthews family didn't ask for attention, but it found them anyway. Someone spotted Daniel at the diner downtown, and by the end of the week half the town knew his name. People were curious, grateful, embarrassed. A few apologized to me outright for not offering help sooner. I accepted it all quietly. This wasn't about blame. It was about seeing each other clearly for the first time in a long while. One evening, a local reporter called and asked if I wanted to share my story. I declined. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want it turned into something flashy or simplified. This wasn't a headline. It was a human exchange that had taken years to come full circle. Instead, something quieter happened. Neighbors started checking on one another more. A church organized a winter emergency plan for stranded drivers. The high school started a fundraiser for families facing medical crises. None of it had my name attached, and that felt right. The Matthews family visited often, not with grand gestures, just with dinners and conversations and shared silences. Watching Emily talk with Michael, seeing how easily they connected despite everything, filled me with a strange, peaceful joy. Two lives intersecting again, grown and changed, yet tied together by something simple and unbreakable. One afternoon, as snow began to fall lightly outside, Emily turned to me and said, "Mom, do you think you'd still open the door?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, "every time." She smiled, thoughtful. "I think I would too." Standing at the window watching the town move along under a thin blanket of white, I realized something that surprised me. The healing hadn't stopped with Emily's heart. It had spread outward, touching corners of my life, and this town I didn't even know were wounded. Kindness, it turns out, doesn't just come back, it multiplies. I stayed in that house. Not because it was suddenly free of hardship, or because everything magically became easy, but because it was still home. The walls still held the echoes of laughter and tears. The porch light still cast the same warm glow across the snow in winter. And every time I unlocked the door, I remembered that it wasn't the house that had been saved, it was the life inside it. Emily recovered steadily. Slowly at first, then with more confidence. Her color returned. Her laughter came back stronger, fuller, like it had been waiting just beneath the surface all along. We settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by gratitude rather than fear. Mornings felt lighter, nights felt quieter, and for the first time in years I slept without waking up to calculate numbers in my head. The Matthews family became part of our lives in an easy, unforced way. Sunday dinners, occasional phone calls, birthday cards sent without fanfare. They never acted like benefactors, and I never treated them like heroes. We met in the middle as people who understood that life had brushed past us all a little too closely and changed us because of it. One afternoon, as winter edged closer again, I found myself standing at the front window watching the first real snowfall of the season. The flakes fell softly, lazily, nothing like the storm that had started it all. Emily came up beside me, resting her head against my shoulder. "Mom," she said, "do you ever wish you'd done something differently?" I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about the fear I'd felt opening my door that night, the exhaustion, the risk. I thought about the months of debt and sleepless nights, the pen hovering over the paper that nearly took everything from me. And I thought about the look on her face when the doctor said the surgery had been a success. "No," I said finally, "I don't." She nodded as if that answer settled something inside her. As I've gotten older, I've come to believe that most of life isn't shaped by the big moments we prepare for. It's shaped by the small ones we don't. A knock on the door, a choice made when no one is watching, a decision that feels ordinary at the time but carries weight far beyond what we can see. We live in a world that tells us to protect ourselves first, to lock our doors, to mind our own business, to assume the worst. And sometimes those instincts keep us safe, but sometimes they keep us apart. What that blizzard taught me, what losing and then nearly losing everything taught me, is that kindness isn't weakness. It's courage. It's the willingness to stand in uncertainty and choose humanity anyway. It doesn't always come back the way we expect. Sometimes it doesn't come back at all. But when it does, it carries something with it that money and security never could: connection. I don't tell this story because I think I'm special. I tell it because I'm not. I'm just someone who opened a door when it mattered. Anyone could have done it. Anyone still can. If you've lived long enough, you've had your own blizzards. Moments when the road disappeared. Times when you needed help and didn't know where it would come from. Or times when you were the one standing warm and dry while someone else stood in the cold. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this: don't underestimate the quiet power of doing the right thing when it costs you something, especially when it costs you something. The world doesn't always reward it quickly, but it remembers. And maybe years from now, when you least expect it, when you're tired or afraid or on the edge of losing something you love, it will find its way back to you. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of someone you helped, or someone who helped you, I hope you'll share it. Talk about it. Pass it on. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about ordinary people, hard choices, and the quiet moments that shape a life, consider subscribing and staying with us a little longer. Thank you for listening. And if there's a knock at your door tonight, I hope you remember that sometimes opening it can change everything.